Then at 7 o'clock, he'll have a lecture that evening. Saturday, March the 2nd, is the grand opening of our First Nations exhibit hall. It's actually a reopening, but it is much, much grander than it has ever been, and I think that you will be really excited. We will also have archaeologists on hand here to talk with you and to help you identify any artifacts that you might have. You might have a point or a piece of pottery and you're wanting to identify what it's made of or where it might have come from or what it was used for, and they'll be here to help you with that. So that is, I can't remember what time, 10?
10 until 3.
10 till 3.
And we'll also have archaeologists talking about some studies they've done.
That's true.
And they've made some real discoveries with some of our points. They've done some
stuff.
Special stuff.
Okay, and then on Saturday, March the 16th, we will have our last Saturday program of celebrating Native American traditions, past and present, which is a grant program that we worked with the Lower Eastern Cherokee Nation, and is funded by the South Carolina Arts Commission. And that's a big day for us, so please come out to that. Now, I'd like to introduce Carin Bloom. Connie Post and I were fortunate enough to go to the state, what is the name of that?
ALFAM, is it ALFAM or
The one in
AASLH?
the South Carolina.
The Association for Living History, Farms and Museums, that one?
I think it was that.
Or the Association for State and Local History.
Anyway, it was a conference. It was a conference in Columbia back in the fall. And we got to listen to Carin and then talk to her a little bit later. And I found out that she was willing to come and do some talks, and I said, we have to have her. We have to have her. So I'm just so excited for her to be here with us. Let me tell you a little bit about her. Right now, she is the education manager at Middleton Place Plantation. And that's really cool because she'll be speaking about that tonight. She has been just recently the manager of education and programming for Historic Charleston Foundation. And while she was there, she planned fun, informational programming, and digital history for learners of all ages. Carin came to South Carolina from the Philadelphia area, where she went to school for historical archaeology. And she was excavating at Valley Forge National Historic Park. She has an honors Bachelor of Arts from the University of Delaware and Masters of Arts from both the University of Pennsylvania and Temple University, all focusing on the history and archaeology of the American Revolution. She's been doing public history for over 20 years at various sites in the Mid-Atlantic and in the Charleston area. She's dedicated to bringing underrepresented narratives to light and moving the history field forward as an inclusive discipline that shares diverse and necessary stories from all perspectives. So welcome, Carin.
Columbia, it must have been AASLH. Must have been the
that.
Association for State and Local History. I don't know. Trying to be members of all of these organizations. It's important. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I am super excited to share this story with you. Lucy Banbury was enslaved at Middleton Place, we think. She was certainly enslaved to a fellow named Arthur Middleton, and her remarkable story of self-emancipation and freedom is one that deserves to be told, and it is being told in Women Waging War, the women in the American Revolution. So it is a chapter, it's chapter 10 in this book called Women Waging War in the American Revolution. There you go, which is published by UVA Press. And I'm really sorry because I only have a chapter because it's not a whole book by me. I didn't, the publisher didn't send me any. But you can buy them from Lawrence County Museum or from Amazon, or if you like, you can support the press. I try to get people to buy them from the press. They'll be cheaper on Amazon.
I was supposed to mention this. I have a few copies that after the presentation, we'll go downstairs and you can talk with Carin, and if you want to purchase one, I'm sure she would.
I'll sign my name on it, on my chapter if you want. Yeah. So all that to say that I did not create this research. I have compiled this research. There were many others who I'll thank at the end of this who created this research, but the research was created, and then it was in a file folder at Middleton Place Foundation, and I said, no, that's not enough. Of course it's not. So I know that this is very small. Don't worry, everything will get bigger. If I can make my own machine. All right, so we're gonna start here with the Middleton Place Foundation because this is where Lucy's story begins. And just to give you a little background on Middleton Place. Middleton Place is a nonprofit, it's 501c3 nonprofit educational trust that was created in 1974. The foundation owns the landscape, the built environment, the collections, and the interpretive areas that are together responsible for stewarding a very complex narrative. Middleton Place welcomes visitors from all over the world who wish to get a sense of country life in South Carolina, most often in the 18th and 19th centuries. Starting in 1991, the house that's pictured here, Eliza's house, became the focal point for the Beyond the Fields exhibit, which later expanded into a book and a documentary film of the same name. You can go to Middleton Place today and have a tour called Beyond the Fields, which is specifically focused on the enslaved experience, but that's not the only place that you get the enslaved experience at Middleton Place. And one of the things that I'm proud to say we're doing is continuing to evolve that narrative and to include the descendants of the enslaved who were the very first interpreters on the property. The very first interpreters of history on this property were 4 or 5 women who were descended of the enslaved population there. So there would be no Middleton Place Foundation without Mary, Martha, Anna, and Eliza. And so we get to tell their stories as well. Central to the Beyond the Fields exhibit is this wall right here. This sign has since been updated. It includes Lucy and John Banbury's names now. It didn't when I took this picture. This is a list of over 2,600 names. We know that there were over 3,000 people enslaved by the Middleton family over the course of about 150 years. So several generations worth of people across several plantations. This is the only site that still remains that was owned by the Middletons as a publicly accessible site. So we steward all of those names, and the search continues for more. So this memorial wall here right in the center of Eliza's house is the main focal point for the Beyond the Fields exhibit. Eliza's house is a freedman's cottage. It has been on the landscape, although in different places, since it was built in 1871. And 2 of the enslaved workers, well, I just said that, they actually are on the list now. I was about to say 2 enslaved workers I'm going to talk about today were not on the list, but they are now. So that's a great addition. Okay. So today, Middleton Place is designated a National Historic Landmark. And it's designated a National Historic Landmark because it was a plantation that was owned and operated by a fellow named Arthur Middleton. I imagine living in such a historic county as Lawrence County, you all are familiar with the Declaration of Independence and the fact that a fellow named Arthur Middleton signed it. That's why it's a National Historic Landmark today. Luckily, there are other stories to tell besides his. So that's what I want to talk about today, people that Arthur claimed as his property. John and Lucy's story is compelling, but I have to say that it is far from complete. This entire presentation, this entire book chapter are based on 4 primary source records, 4 pieces of paper that list John and Lucy Banbury's names. And from that, we have to work to construct a story about their lives, chiefly after they left enslavement. There's going to be a lot in this presentation about the climate of the low country of South Carolina during the American War for Independence. There's going to be a lot of background and context information about who the Black loyalists were and what it meant to be a Black loyalist, because these are the general history pieces that we need to use to fill in some of the experiences that John and Lucy probably had, and most especially Lucy. Not to say that John is not an important fellow, but it is very rare that we have an African woman's life story post-emancipation, so that's where we're focusing today. There are holes in this timeline. What we do know is that John and Lucy made a choice to attempt the ultimate form of resistance. They successfully persisted. They completed separately their journeys to freedom, escaping slavery for the promise of freedom by Lord Dunmore and the British Army. There were no guarantees that the British government was going to make good on their promise. So what compelled John and Lucy to run? Was it the despair that was imminent in staying enslaved, or was it simply that the reward was great enough to take the risk? People in the enslaved community, and if you don't know much about Lord Dunmore and the proclamation, don't worry, we'll get back to it, I promise. We're setting the stage. People in the enslaved community like John and Lucy Banbury had a limited number of choices before war broke out between the colonies and King George III. South Carolina enacted slave laws that were nothing short of draconian, following tumultuous years in the early half of the 18th century. This included episodes like the Stono Rebellion in 1739. Running away was a risk with a heavy price, but when Lord Dunmore proclaimed guaranteed freedom to any formerly enslaved person who crossed British lines and signed up with the British Army, that became too enticing to pass up for large numbers of enslaved people. In South Carolina, Whig colonists had anger. Whigs, of course, are the Continentals. Let me see if I always have to find my person. Okay. So this is the timeline that we're working with. We will revisit this frequently. All right, so I'm going to stay right there. So Whig colonists, these patriots, Continentals, they had anger because they perceived oppression by the British Crown, right? They had great fear of large-scale slave revolts in the face of proclamations like Lord Dunmore's proclamation. So already colonists are talking about getting out from under King George and the Crown's government using the language of slavery. Right? No taxation without representation. You treat us as if we're slaves. Ironic, coming from slaveholding colonies. So they're already in the sort of victimhood mindset. And when they hear Lord Dunmore's proclamation, which only applied to Virginia, I have to say, this promise that said anybody coming to the British lines from the colony of Virginia would be free. So for the enslaved in Virginia, freedom wore a red coat, not a blue one. So we can talk about what does liberty mean, who is fighting for liberty and whose liberty, what does liberty mean to certain individuals. For those who are under the yoke of oppression, liberty wears a red coat. It looks like this guy. This is John Murray, the 4th Earl of Dunmore, painted by Joshua Reynolds. So the colonists are looking at this fear that there's going to be not just subversive action, like running away, but large-scale proactive resistance in the form of revolts. The Stono Rebellion was a near thing. It almost succeeded. And this was the fear that Continental militiamen and plantation owners are carrying into this war for independence. After South Carolinians lynched Thomas Jeremiah, a free black sea captain accused and convicted of plotting to help Royal Navy vessels enter Charlestown Harbor, it was documented that 500 blacks escaped to Sullivan's Island to join the British. So actions have consequences and reactions. Thomas Jeremiah was a free black man who was a pilot on the Charlestown Harbor, and there was no evidence against him. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it actually prompted this mass exodus of enslaved people who decided that it was worth the while, worth the risk to try and escape, and 500 left. If you don't know too much about the Battle of Sullivan's Island, it was called the Battle of Sullivan's Island, Battle of Fort Sullivan. Today, that's Fort Moultrie. So the Battle of Fort Sullivan is how we celebrate Carolina Day today, June 28th of 1776. Was the first continental victory over the British Royal Navy. But the British were in the harbor in numbers, in multitudes, tens of thousands of men on a couple dozen ships. So it was a good way for those who were in the enslaved population in the Low Country to escape, because the British lines were right there. They were right there. They didn't have to go north into the upcountry here. They didn't have to try and make it to Virginia or south to Florida. The British were right there. It was as close a striking distance as they could get. So it made sense that they would run to the British lines. Still, we don't really have any evidence of formerly enslaved people participating much in the Battle of Sullivan's Island, because there was a comedy of errors in terms of the British Royal Navy. They really had trouble assaulting Sullivan's Island in the end, and they did not succeed. And the army that was supposed to come around Long Island, which was up here, that's now Isle of Palms, and they were supposed to march down across some of these sandbars and take the fort from the rear. Well, that ended up not working because they had some scouts that gave them bad information. Oh, sure, at low tide, there's, it's totally wadeable, just 6 inches. No, those waters never get below about 7 feet. So there was no way that infantrymen were going to be able to march across those sandbars and take the fort from the flank. So there was a comedy of errors there, and so we don't really have much information about the enslaved or formerly enslaved who may have participated in that battle, because really there wasn't much of a battle at all. So Thomas Jeremiah was used as a scapegoat, basically, for the Patriots' anti-imperial and pro-enslavement sentiments to flourish. So it's this interesting mental gymnastics of, we want to get out from under the yoke of the slavery of the crown, and also we want to have our liberty in order to enslave other people. This is the sort of anti-imperial, pro-enslavement sentiment that was quite prolific during this period of American Revolution. So it is no wonder that this proclamation made people in the Carolinas nervous, even though it only applied to Virginia, because it also meant that if somebody could escape from South Carolina and make it to Virginia, now they are not only formerly enslaved, they're in the colony upon which this proclamation has effect. So we think that's what Lucy did. If John and Lucy had waited 4 more years, if they had not left, he left in 1776, she ran in 1777. If they had waited another 4 years for the war to come back to South Carolina, they probably wouldn't have gained safety and they wouldn't have succeeded. So it was in their best interest to go and to go early. And we'll talk a little bit about that in upcoming slides here. So there's no documentation at the present time about John and Lucy's specific place of bondage, but Middleton Place was the biggest plantation that the Middletons owned, and it was the family empire and showpiece. So we think that it is very likely that John and Lucy were enslaved at Middleton Place specifically. We don't know the direct point of origin for their escape, but again, we think it was probably Middleton Place. Lucy's journey to freedom after her husband's, a year after her husband's, could have looked like John's, but I don't think so. John escaped in 1776. That's when the British are in the neighborhood. That's when they're thinking about assaulting Fort Sullivan. He would have had a pretty close encounter. By 1777, the British had a score of Cherokee allies here in the upcountry. and their raiding was unsuccessful in the face of Patriot opposition. Eventually, there's actually a concurrent war that happens with the American War for Independence. It's called the Cherokee War, and it actually ended in American victory. The Cherokee Nation, in a treaty called the Treaty of DeWitt's Corner, ceded most of their land to the Continentals. And since they were British allied native peoples, when the Cherokee were moved off the land, the British lost access as well. So there are no British folks by 1777, by May of 1707, in South Carolina. Maybe a few bands of loyalist militia here and there, but no standing army. It would have been really hard for Lucy to find them in this state. They didn't come back in force until the Siege of Savannah in December of the following year, 1778. So it's likely that Lucy had to travel further from her state of bondage than her husband did. And so what about the potential pitfalls? What do we know about taking action to run from bondage? Pretty well-known environmental hazards, right? We talk about heat and humidity taking tolls on the body, not to mention hunger or thirst. There's always standing water in the low country, always standing water in the low country, and its associated diseases, which would have been very familiar to those who were held in bondage on plantations. Things like foot rot, typhoid, dysentery. These all come from either being in or ingesting standing, non-moving water. Then there's malaria, which is carried and spread by mosquitoes, the wildlife in the marshes and fields, alligators, all manner of snakes, mammals that prowl at night. To suggest that the odds were stacked against someone like Lucy would be an understatement. She would have carried little to nothing but the clothing that she wore, and there would have been some question about traveling together with others versus traveling alone. Traveling together would have been helpful, but groups would have had to walk a very fine line between having enough people in the group to protect each other and to share the burden of what it would take to make that escape, and having such a great number that you would cause unwanted attention. Slave catchers would have been everywhere, all over the landscape, and too many people would have caused too much noise and too much disturbance to not be noticed. As James Walker details in a book he wrote called The Black Loyalists, quote, "They swam, they hiked, they stowed away in boats and wagons, they carried each other to safety with the redcoats. Many took advantage of the temporary presence of a British army in the neighborhood to make a bid for freedom. Others made a longer journey to the British strongholds, such as Charleston and Savannah, when they were here. Among the Americans who were prominent in the articulation of the Declaration of Independence as a charter of human liberty, James Madison, Benjamin Harrison, Arthur Middleton, and George Washington himself all lost slaves who fled to the banner of British security." Through this glimpse into the physical environment, Lucy's travails come more clearly into focus, even as the details aren't specific to her as an individual. It doesn't require an especially creative mind to conjure the courage and determination and resilience that someone like Lucy needed to survive, even as the world that she knew, even in bondage, an ordered world that she knew just evolved into chaos. Maybe we do that. So the title of the book in which Lucy's story is included is Women Waging War in the American Revolution. And in fact, it is Lucy's story that I'm trying to tell. Unfortunately, like much of history, Lucy is most clearly visible through the lens of the male-dominated world that she inhabited. To that end, her life has to be teased out from between the lines of military and economic records. The stories of men escaping to the British Army, rare as they are, do exist, and they're fairly easy to follow. Though they're not individually detailed, Black Loyalist regiments that formed had specific duties, and their service is documented, entire regiments. You can see here a fellow who's an aide to Major Pearson in his pioneer green, very clearly a black man who's fighting on the British side. We don't know his name. So here are some modern renditions, one by Don Troiani and one by Bob Graham, giving some information about some of the regiments that Black Loyalists would have served. These slides show depictions of Black pioneers, which is what most of the units in the British Army were. So fellows who were scouts and guides for British regulars to navigate the treacherous landscapes of the southern colonies. All of a sudden you wonder if there were some of those maybe on the continental side, and that's why the Battle of Fort Sullivan didn't go the British way. Others were construction crews. So this fellow here is mostly what we're going to see. Most of the time you're not going to see Black dragoons, although of course there were some filling in the white regiments. But the Black pioneers here, this is mostly what formerly enslaved men served as in the American War for Independence on the British side. So their jobs were to be construction crews, digging endless trenches, building earthworks. Some were foragers, or even service workers, right? Domestic servants, porters, butlers, those kinds of things. It continued to be that idea of probably better not give them a gun. Which, again, if you're promising freedom to people, obviously there were still biases and limitations that existed in the British mind about offering this freedom. Interestingly enough, I do have one example here of a fellow in the Continental Army. So the fellow on the far left is an American soldier. He is a Black soldier in the Rhode Island regiments. And it turns out that no offer of freedom existed for Black patriots, but they did serve the cause. There were a number of them at Valley Forge. And this soldier is depicted as part of the Rhode Island Regiment, which was distinct by their white uniforms, the white hunting shirt, the leather helmet, and the blue and white feathers. If you're interested in seeing some folks reenact this, there are a few up in the Mid-Atlantic and the Philadelphia, New Jersey, Pennsylvania region who actually recreate this uniform and give this history. Antoine Randolph-Waits is one of the folks that I'm thinking of, so you should look him up on social media. You will not be disappointed. Along with this, women. Women served. They followed both armies. When I say served, I don't mean in uniform. Women followed both armies, sometimes out of necessity, but you can see them here even in contemporary images. This is a perspective view of a British encampment published in 1780. And you can see women all over. The one that I circled and blew up here isn't the only one. They're everywhere in this encampment. Here's one walking with, presumably, her husband. Here are some others over here. There are women all throughout the tents, running after children, running dram shops, which is a bar in a tent. Whether they were formerly enslaved or not, there were jobs for women to fill. This is why we surmise that part of Lucy's story, she's not only listed in a book which contemporarily was called the Book of Negroes, but also in the 1784 muster roll of Port Roseway Associates in Nova Scotia. And the other piece of evidence we have for her is a list from Sierra Leone in 1791. So, like her white counterparts, it is most likely that Lucy was one of three things. She was probably a laundress, a seamstress, or a nurse. Interestingly enough, all these things that you see about women cooking for the army soldiers, no. The army messes cooked for themselves. Women who were assigned to the Continental Army were only issued a half ration of what the men were given. So if I were given a half ration, or rather if I were given a full ration, I probably wouldn't trust anybody to cook if they only got a half ration, they'd be skimming off the top. So the men knew how to cook for themselves, the exception being the officers, and we're talking on both sides of the war here, very mirrored experience. Whether continental officers or British officers, there's a chance that somewhere in there was a woman cooking for them. But most often it was probably folks who were domestic servants, again, either formerly enslaved or European free. There were people of lower socioeconomic status that found employment cooking for the officers. And I will say, on both sides of the army, regardless of the woman doing this work, these were paid jobs. They were paid jobs. It wasn't just rations issued. So again, an incentive to come to the British lines and serve. It's possible that she was taken or employed by an officer as a cook, or even as a lady's servant for an officer's wife. If there was an officer's wife here in the colonies with that officer and his regiment, she may have been a servant for that lady. The services of women were recorded and preserved in some instances, just like those of men, prior to the archive that became the Book of Negroes. Unfortunately, Lucy's actual service is unrecorded, so we don't know that for her specifically. So the scene on the left is something that would have been familiar to Lucy as a camp follower. That's what life would have looked like. Now, this soldier's wife here on the left is actually a widow. That's why she's wearing his regimental coat. And women who were widows in the army had to remarry a different soldier within a certain amount of time, or else they weren't allowed to follow the army anymore. So it's interesting, this pencil sketch depiction would have been in a very specific time in this woman's life, after her husband had died, but before she was drummed out of camp. And you can see she's got a baby, so much the worse for her. The women on the right are free women of color with their children and servants. This comes from Dominica. So this side of life is probably one that Lucy had only ever heard about, or maybe dreamed of. It's certainly, the free women of color of the Caribbean were not the only dream that one may want to attain, but they were certainly an example of the possibilities that existed beyond the condition of enslavement and may have served as an incentive for folks to run. Now, I think that the best incentive is simply one's own liberty. But surely aspiring to a station like the ladies held in the Caribbean was something that many women surely dreamed of. You know what I need to invest in now is one of those clickers. I got this brand new cable and it's working brilliantly, but now I don't have a clicker, sorry. Okay, so to revisit this timeline, which I only showed you shortly, we surmise that Lucy was born in Africa in about 1743. It's questionable it was somewhere around there. John was a couple years younger than her by some of the records, so we'll put his estimated time of birth around 1745, location unknown. In 1755, Lord Dunmore issues his proclamation, freedom for any enslaved and British who escape and come in Virginia, for any enslaved to escape and come to British lines. In 1776, John had probably heard about that. I have to tell you that the information network between enslaved communities all throughout the colonies was extensive and it was fast moving. Folks definitely got information to their distant family, their distant relatives, their family and friends in other colonies. And before the Underground Railroad ran north in the 19th century, it ran south in the 18th century. The very first escaped enslaved people ran to St. Augustine and specifically to Fort Mose down in Spanish East Florida. Because the Spanish said, if you convert to Catholicism, we'll leave you alone, we don't care, as long as you convert to Catholicism. And so it was a true haven of liberty for those who wished to self-emancipate. So the Underground Railroad existed long before most people thought it did, and it ran south, not north. 1777, Lucy makes her escape and makes her way to the British lines. We're not sure where, probably Virginia. That was the nearest that the British Army was at that time. In 1780, the siege of Charleston happens. So now the British are back in Savannah, they're back in Charleston with a force. John and Lucy's whereabouts at this time are unrecorded. By 1783, they have linked up again. They have found each other somehow. We know it because they are reported in New York in Franz's Tavern. It's a tavern that still exists today. You can go there and have a drink and learn something because it's a museum. They were recorded in that archive that became the Book of Negroes together on July 31st of 1783, one right after the other. So somehow, after all that time, after 6 years, they found each other. And they boarded a Black Loyalist ship together, La Beaumont, bound for Nova Scotia. So how did they get there? Back in Carolina, as the late 1770s continued, along with the diminished British presence came a demand from patriots. With every battle that was won on the Whig side, they were calling for the return of property that had been lost or stolen. Many British officers were faced with the decision of upholding their word to honor the self-emancipated nature of the enslaved people who escaped, or to follow the proper conduct of war, which at that time did in fact mean the return of confiscated property. So if there is a newly free Black person serving an officer in the British Army, technically this is contraband property, and that individual, by rights in war, should be returned to their enslaver. Eventually, the calls became so great that somebody in command needed to address the situation. And it came down to a fellow named Sir Guy Carleton. He was the author of the ledger that became known as the Book of Negroes. He was responsible for giving the official British response to the call for return of property. It was Carleton who also personally recorded the Banburys in the book in 1783 in New York. So, whether she was making her way to the British in the neighborhood, unlikely, or whether she was taking the longer route, Lucy persevered through all potential setbacks to find herself and her husband in New York City in 1783 and on a ship bound for Halifax. Upon examining a study of the copies of the Book of Negroes, there are 3 copies known in existence, and a woman named Ruth Whitehead did a study of each of them because they've been copied over, so they don't all match. Here's one, which you can find online for free in the digital archives for Nova Scotia. Upon examining Ruth's study of these copies, there's actually some suggestion from one of the copies that Lucy and John may not have been the only Banburys to escape. They are listed with Tom Kane and his wife Scylla, listed as Scylla Banbury in one copy of the book. And they're the entries right underneath John and Lucy. Though Tom and Scylla are documented as having escaped in 1776, so now the question is, did they go with John? Did they all go together? All 4 sailed together for Nova Scotia from New York. So by at least 1783, Lucy is reunited not only with her husband, but possibly with some of her kin as well. Now, a number of those whose names are recorded in the book have not only their names, ages, and physical descriptions listed, but as I mentioned, which service they performed on behalf of the Crown. Some historians suggest that British ship captains would not have accepted petitions to Nova Scotia, petitions to be on board these ships, from runaways who had not served. And if that holds true, then we know that both Lucy and John did in fact perform paid service for the British Army in order to get on these boats. This is also then where we start when we want to see the records of women in service to the Army, the British Army in particular. So perhaps this entry, what I've got here for you, this is not the one with Tom and Scylla Kane, but this is John Banbury here, and this is Lucy a few rows down. And right up there, all in here where there's lots of cursive that is difficult to read, don't worry, I got it. Perhaps this entry indicates a service rendered to the British Army from Lucy of her own accord, because if she had just been a follower of her husband, she would have been listed in the same line as him. She gets her own line. She did her own service. Unfortunately, we don't know what that was. John's service was laborer. So it's a good chance that he was one of those black pioneers, one of the construction crew, earthworks diggers, chevaux de frise constructors, something like that. That was most likely his job. From the research that Ruth Holmes Whitehead has done into all 3 copies of the Book of Negroes, the best we can say is that both John and Lucy are recorded as having, quote, escaped to the British Army. So John's line is listed like this: John Banbury, 38, stout fellow, formerly the property of Arthur Middleton of Charlestown, South Carolina, left him 7 years ago. Lucy is listed as Lucy Banbury, 40, stout wench, with her son. We don't know anything about him. He was only in 1 copy of the book. I have more research to do. Formerly the property of Arthur Middleton of Charlestown, South Carolina. As an interesting aside, the historical record speaks to former enslaved persons' occupations. They also describe the sheer numbers of soldiers and workers and followers that would have augmented the British forces. For example, the military return for Stuart's Black Company, as it was called, an entire regiment of black soldiers, indicates that the number of women and children associated with that regiment, just the women and children in this return, 6,510 for that one regiment. When I tell you that folks left in droves, took their fates into their own hands, I mean it. What remarkable stories that we have completely lost. We have to find them. It was roughly equal to that of the black men in other returns. So a lot of people made their way and a lot of women served. Lucy, John, Tom, and Scylla all sailed for Nova Scotia in 1784. They were inspected at France's Tavern on the same day, like I said, July 31st of 1783, and they were eventually on board this ship. Now, one more thing before I get there. Sir Guy Carleton's address, remember I said it became his job to address this outcry for return of property? Well, he had correspondence back and forth with none other than His Excellency George Washington himself. Many, many pages of letters, which they made me cut out and condense because my chapter was too long. So I had to find, I was so upset. You can find these on Founders Archive online as well. You can read the whole correspondence for yourself. I think that's why they made me cut most of it. But I have some gems right here that I want to share with you because Carleton decided, Patriot slave owners petitioned him and his board of inquiry to reclaim their lost property, but he determined that refugees who had resided within the British lines at least 12 months were free to depart. Well, if John and Lucy, and that was dated 1783. Further, Carleton determined that blacks who were already with the British before 30 November 1782 and who claimed freedom by the proclamations, that would be Lord Dunmore's, and then the Philipsburg Proclamation, which said the exact same thing as Lord Dunmore's, only it now applied to all of the colonies, not just Virginia, then these people were technically free and therefore could not be considered as American property on that date. If the Banburys had waited to leave, if they had waited until 1780, or if they had waited until the British were evacuating. Do you know when the British evacuated Charlestown? December 14, 1782. And this date is November 30, 1782. If they had waited to run to the British when the British were evacuating, they would have still been considered property and would have been returned. So the fact that they chose to leave when they did, they made that hard decision and they acted, is probably one of the things that tipped the scales in their favor. Even as Carleton came to his decisions, he was receiving pushback from the most powerful American in the land. George Washington himself argued that all enslaved people that had once been owned should still be considered property. None were eligible to depart. Though Carleton did not acquiesce to Washington's wishes, he stood firm. I want to take a moment to imagine what an intense moment that must have been as a Black loyalist. Twice escaped former slave Boston King described the experience of waiting for Carleton's final decision. This was all over town. Everybody knew that this argument was happening. Everybody knew that Carleton could fold and give in and say, give all the people who used to be property back their property again. Everybody knew. No one was in the dark. And Boston King was waiting for the decision. He said, this dreadful rumor filled us all with inexpressible anguish and terror, especially when we saw our old masters coming from Virginia, North Carolina, and other parts, seizing upon their slaves in the streets of New York, or even dragging them out of their beds. Many of the slaves had very cruel masters, so that the thought of returning home with them embittered life to us. For some days we lost our appetite for food, and sleep departed from our eyes. Surely Lucy and John and Tom and Scylla and many others, recorded and unrecorded, experienced that kind of fear and terror and trepidation and sleepless nights. So I can only imagine their relief when they finally got on board that ship and made their way to Nova Scotia. Well, whatever sense of relief Lucy might have felt was to be short-lived, because the voyage lasted just over a month. It began on August 2nd of 1783, and it ended with all passengers discharged on September 3rd in what would soon be called Birchtown, Nova Scotia. But this ship had a first stop in Shelburne, and the log references that many of the Black Loyalist passengers aboard L'Abondance in particular had fallen ill. So they went ashore and set up a temporary tent hospital, and 53 ill persons were sent to it on Monday, August 18th. Only a couple weeks later, those names are not recorded, so we don't know if John or Lucy were among the sick, or Tom or Scylla. But can you imagine being on board a ship saying, oh, it's only going to take a couple of weeks, 4 weeks at most. 2 weeks in, you have to make a stop, and who knows where slave catchers are? Who knows if Carleton is reversing his decision? Who knows? Until feet are on the ground in Birchtown, every moment could have been terrifying. So imagine making this stop to quarantine for sick passengers, because what happens if you don't take sick passengers off the ship? The whole ship gets sick, and then a lot of people die. Well, I'm sure that there was a lot of trepidation again, but those who were ill, nobody died. Everybody recovered, and they were eventually brought back on board the ship, and off it went to Birchtown to land at their final port of call on September 3rd. If potential illness wasn't enough to cause consternation, there was the matter of unfulfilled promises from the Crown and discrimination against free blacks that folks like Lucy and John surely encountered the moment they came ashore. So, if you don't know much about the resettlement of Black Loyalists in Nova Scotia, I'm going to give you the Cliff's Notes version. And this is from The Black Loyalists, that same book by Walker. The intention of the British government had been that no loyalist, black or white, should be required to become a wage laborer. Provisions were promised, partly as a reward for their loyalty to the Crown and as compensation for their losses, but primarily to sustain them during their first few years in Nova Scotia until their new farms could become productive and established and enabled to support themselves. Unfortunately, there are problems of land and provision shortages, and that was an end quote. And those land and provision shortages arose in mid-1783, before John and Lucy even got on the ship. So what was happening was that they were issuing land and provisions, the British Crown was, in accordance with how they considered loyalists had lost or sacrificed or left behind something. So the richest loyalists on these ships were given the most land and the most provisions. The people who had lost the most were given the most. And what that meant was that by the time the landscape came into possession of newly free black people, There wasn't much land left to give. So even though they had been promised 40 acres, a particular amount of food, particular provisioning, livestock to start their farm, most of the time that wasn't given. Maybe a fraction of it, maybe nothing at all. So, coupled with the presence of enslavement still being practiced in Nova Scotia. So there were still people who owned other people. By those of European descent, Lucy and John arrived into an unpredictable scenario once again. Free and still enslaved blacks mingled at will in Birchtown and in other ports in Nova Scotia. And the enslavers there, because of this, quickly lost their hold, their psychological hold on human property. Because now there are those who are enslaved coming face to face with those who look just like them who are free. And suddenly this physical, this psychological hold on people in this yoke of oppression is shattered. There is no reason why that individual is free and I am not. It spelled demise for the institution of enslavement in Nova Scotia and in coastal Canada in general, in the region. Still, it was difficult for enslavers to maintain this mental system of oppression, but the disdain for people who were free of African descent remained. So there's still this long ingrained understanding of American slavery as a means to exploit humans for work and economic gain. And again, I quote from the Black Loyalists, blacks were usually considered to be nothing but a source of labor. It was this economic attitude taken by white people, rather than any identifiable belief in racial inferiority, that was cause to the most discriminatory situations. Now, that's older scholarship. We know now that it was both things. It was indeed this economic view of black people are meant for labor and improvement of the economy, and also a belief in a racial inferiority that were the problems here. John described in the muster book of the free black settlement of Birchtown, and that's this 1784 muster roll. They're both listed in this muster roll of the free black settlement of Birchtown. And he's listed again as a laborer, which means wage laborer, which is the thing that the Crown said nobody was going to have to be. So it's probable that this is precisely the employment that he fell into the trap of, despite the Crown's promises. So again, broken promises, an unstable situation. Freedom, yes, but with what stipulations, with what conditions, and at what cost? Oh, my entire tablet went to sleep. That's fine. Okay, so there is the list of Port Roseway associates. Just so you know, this is the ledger that records John and Lucy's arrival in Nova Scotia. Here they're listed, and some people have asked me in the past whether John and Lucy were most definitely married or whether they were brother and sister. He's the head of household and she's listed just under him. That's usually how husbands and wives are listed in these ledgers. So, the image on the left here is caricatured. It is the closest thing I could find to what might have looked familiar to Lucy as a free woman in Nova Scotia. Now, Rose Fortune was a real person, but her features have been exaggerated again according to that bias that we've just been talking about in terms of ideas that people of European descent have about this racial inferiority. So her features have been exaggerated, but Rose Fortune was a real woman. She was free. So this is probably a closer depiction of clothing that Lucy may have been familiar with, may have been wearing, property that she would have been carrying. She's got a handbasket with notions and things in it. This one on the right here, probably again a little more like that dream vision of the free women of color in the Caribbean, the women who are of status and who have their own servants to care for them. And this one in particular uses the very outdated term free woman of color with quadroon daughter, suggesting that this woman herself is not fully of African descent, and then that her daughter as well is not fully of African descent. This is a late 18th century painting. So the Banburys did eventually own land. Even though John was listed originally as a laborer, they eventually owned land and they became farmers. Being able to provide for their own lives and being able to own land that had value were both great rewards for the risk that they had undertaken in their years-long search for freedom. Even then, we can contrast this image of a free black loyalist making her way in Nova Scotia with the image on the right, a wealthy free black woman in the Caribbean with a light-skinned daughter. The trappings of these two women, even if this was something that Lucy wanted, and we don't know that it was, is still sort of a bridge too far for Lucy in Nova Scotia. This is more than she could have achieved because of the biases that existed in Nova Scotia. Whether Lucy and John received acreage and provisions from the government is a mystery, or whether he just simply worked very hard, and she probably did too, to save up money to buy their own land. We're not sure. We don't know how they acquired that land, but we do know that they got it. Birchtown was one of 3 all-black settlements in Nova Scotia. The average land grant that the Black Loyalists were supposed to get was 50 acres. In contrast to the 160 plus acres that were recommended for white Loyalists, or the 204 acres that was actually given to most white Loyalists. So you can see why land distribution became a problem right off if white Loyalists were being given more than what was recommended. We don't know whether Lucy and John received all 50 acres and sold some, or whether they saved money from their labors to purchase their own plot, but what we know is that by 1791, they owned 10 acres, part of which is listed as being improved by the government. November of 1791 is when we pick up Lucy's trail again, this time without John. His year of death is not recorded, but by the time Lucy applies for removal to Sierra Leone, she is alone. The list of the blacks in Birchtown who gave their names for Sierra Leone, which is the longest title for a ledger ever, was written in November of 1791. It reveals the final leg of Lucy's journey to freedom. After living in Birchtown for 8 years, presumably creating a life both with and then without her husband, owning land, being a successful farmer, creating community, Lucy makes another independent decision, just like when she decided to leave Arthur Middleton on her own. She applies to be removed to Africa, and she is granted passage. The list reveals some of the few known details of Lucy's life, including an age discrepancy. In 1783, in one of the copies of the Book of Negroes, Lucy is listed at the age of 40, but 8 years later, in this ledger, she's listed at the age of 43. I would like to age like that. I'm back to being 8 years. Bad bookkeeping, I would just like to say, along with bad spelling practices, were standard for the 18th century. So whether she was 43 when she removed to Sierra Leone, or whether she was 48 or 51, it doesn't really matter in this case. Bad bookkeeping aside, we know that one of the most interesting and pertinent pieces of information disclosed in this 1791 list is her place of birth. Lucy herself was interviewed for this ledger, and she identified herself as having been born in Africa, which means that she was kidnapped there, probably brought to South Carolina, and probably, for the duration of her time in bondage, lived in this colony. probably at the Middleton's place. The application for removal to Sierra Leone was a conscious and intentional decision that was made for home going. Home was not here. One can imagine many thoughts and emotions that might have accompanied the pursuance of this opportunity for a self-emancipated woman who likely thought that she would never set foot on her native continent again. Details that are arguably less important, I would say they're important, but somebody might not think so, but they're useful for the development of the richness and complexity of Lucy's life include the minutiae of her occupation as a farmer, her belongings that are listed in this ledger. She's described as a farmer who owned 1 axe, 1 hoe, a 10-acre lot part improved by the government, a chest, 2 other pieces of portable property or luggage, and most importantly, a certificate of good character. Without a certificate like that, anybody who applied to be removed to Sierra Leone would have been denied. And you can see that ledger online at Nova Scotia's online digital archives as well. So from Africa to South Carolina and back again via New York and Nova Scotia and all the points in between that aren't recorded, Lucy deserved her hard-won homecoming. And I put this slide in just in case there is anybody who is unfamiliar with the triangle trade. But what you should know is that Sierra Leone is on the west coast of Africa, just here. It was one of the main, it's even labeled on this particular map as slave coast. Senegal, the Gambia, Sierra Leone, and the Congo and Angola are all really big ports from which people were kidnapped and shipped like so much cargo over to South America, to the Caribbean, and then to the United States. And I hope you all know, but in case you don't, of all of the individuals who were brought to the United States in chains, 40% went through the port of Charleston. The other 60% are scattered all up and down the east coast of the United States. The largest portion of everybody who was enslaved from Africa who came to the United States came through Charleston. So it is most likely that Lucy came through Charleston and stayed in Charleston until she made the decision to leave. So it's important that you know what this route looks like. Lucy embarked for Africa with the company that was enumerated in the list. This is where she returns to, Sierra Leone, Freetown. So named because it was where a lot of the Black loyalists who chose to leave Nova Scotia decided to go, and where people of European descent generally sent them. To date, Middleton Place has neither found nor received record of those who successfully landed in Sierra Leone in 1792, but there is no reason to doubt that Lucy, whose lifetime of arduous travels took her thousands of miles by land and sea, would have arrived safely. If I have the opportunity to continue this research with Middleton Place Foundation, I would desperately like to go to Sierra Leone into their national archives and find Lucy's record of arrival. I think it would be really important to be able to see her story through. It's left to the imagination to consider what her first steps in Sierra Leone must have felt like, as is the idea that she found peace on home soil, even if she never returned to her specific home place of origin. As James Walker notes in The Black Loyalists, quote, land, independence, and security had in fact been among the chief attractions drawing the fleeing slaves to the British during the American War, end quote. But still, after feeling the bonds of servitude as laborers, indentures, or sharecroppers in Nova Scotia, removal to Sierra Leone might have finally seemed like the opportunity for formerly enslaved people to accomplish these simple yet elusive goals of land, independence, and security. The fact that Lucy had already owned land of her own makes her application to leave it all the more rare. And her desire was not just for independence, but for independence in a place that she had strong emotional ties to, family ties, ancestral ties. As Walker so eloquently states, John Clarkson, who funded the expedition, offered not only land, but the promised land. A farm in Nova Scotia was no substitute for an entire country in Africa. We can only imagine if that's how Lucy felt in making her decision, but we can certainly hope that the result was worth all of her sacrifice. Lucy is listed in the book in so many ways, in the Book of Negroes, and then in that list for removal. Nowhere in the many ledgers recording Lucy's life are the following entries, so I have chosen to add them. Lucy Banbury, not just a stout wench, not just a farmer who owned 10 acres. Resilient, determined, perseverant, hopeful, faithful, courageous, and independent, and free. She finally was. So I thank you all very much for your attention. Lucy's story is really close to my heart, and I'm so grateful every time that I get to tell more folks about her so that more people can spread the word about her. And hopefully the next time you hear from me about this topic in particular, I can give you even more. I would love to be able to at least talk to the archives in Sierra Leone and find out more. Hopefully take a trip there myself and walk in her footsteps. And thank you so much for having me. All of these folks are ones who contributed to the research or contributed to the book. And I did in fact make this presentation when I was still at HCF, so a thanks to HCF for letting me spread this word as well. So thank you very much.
Does anybody have any questions?
I do. About Sierra Leone, what was the situation there that a British ship could go there and drop people off? I mean, were they an independent country or had a deal with England?
Yeah, Freetown in Sierra Leone was being sort of created. So they were a free country, and it was sort of being refashioned into this like haven for formerly enslaved people. So the British ships, the shortest way I can say this is, the British ships that once arrived to kidnap or buy people were now arriving to repatriate people. And of course, the people who already live there are like, yeah, come home. So it was seen as a colony. There were other colonies, right? Liberia was created specifically to take in formerly enslaved individuals. That was, you know, in a lot of ways a harebrained scheme of like, get people out of America that don't belong here, which is obviously not true, but right? So it was that same sort of, it was the prototype ideal of that. They did, you know, they want people to be free, and it's like, oh yeah, you can be free, but like, not in America, and not in Canada. You can be free, not free. Like, and it's a difficult thing to talk about. I don't want to be flippant about it, but it is this idea that there is a place for people to go that will take them in, that is an ancestral homeland, and it is really convenient for people of European descent who don't wish to live in concert with people of African descent. It's like a really convenient way to get rid of folks. And so it's like, that is unsavory, right? That's gross. We don't like that. And at the same time, it allows people like Lucy to go home. And so we just have to sort of hold space for both of those things and understand that this notion of we have no interest in living with people of African descent ended up with a solution that was good for a lot of people, but also not good for a lot of people. The later generations of people who are enslaved, who are African and American, people who are of African descent, but American born, have no business necessarily going back to Africa. What does that mean, right? So this is a prototype of that kind of idea, and it works for people like Lucy, who is in fact from Africa, is offered a chance to go home.
What would her situation have been? Would she have been offered land there, or?
I don't know, I have to find record of her there. I have to get, and there's really, you know, my excuse for this book was timing. So my excuse now is gone. The book is written, the chapter is written. Now the next chapter has to be, I at least have to email them and say, what can you find me on Lucy Banbury, and understand, when she arrived here, was it literally the pieces of portable luggage and her farming implements and she had to make her way? Was this specifically where she was from and she was able to find family? How did that happen for her? What happened? I don't know what happened. I know she made it. That's all I know. So.
To me, Lucy and John, they were never free. They were never free until she decided to go back to Africa, where she started. So,
right?
You know, she had freedom.
Right.
Never free.
Right? Because who controlled society, right? So who controls, if bias controls the system, then, right, you can have independence, but is it
Who
liberty?
controlled it in Sierra Leone?
Who controlled it? People who looked a lot like Lucy. Yeah.
So what happened to the child?
I don't know. It's another thing that I have to pursue. So if the Sierra Leone National Archives has evidence of Lucy arriving, I would like to think that if she had that child would still be minor enough to be with her. So that would be another question, because the son only appears unnamed in one of the 3 copies of the Book of Negroes. And he isn't on the Port Roseway Associates ledger. He's not on the Nova Scotia ledger, and he's not in the list for removal to Sierra Leone. So there's a good chance that if he did in fact exist, he wasn't he wasn't added to her name instead of somebody under her. So if he existed as her son, there's a good chance that he actually didn't make it. There's a good chance that he probably perished in childhood on one of these many voyages. But if he arrived in Sierra Leone, that's something that the National Archives there should have too. It's a great question, and they're fun. Yeah, I know I have to find out. I know, it's so compelling. I left y'all with a cliffhanger. This is how I get to come back.
Since slavery continued for a long time, and she was captured there to start with, and one tribe was capturing another and selling them, what would prevent her from being caught and sent back over?
So 1791 is when she goes. She probably arrives late that year or early the following year, and the international slave trade is outlawed in this country in 1807. So the good news is it wasn't that much longer, but the way that Sierra Leone was being set up with Freetown, it was a town of free blacks, right? Free people who had been enslaved who are now running the government by themselves, to your question. So that would not have been a port that slave ships would have been entering. Nobody's gonna be sold from Freetown. It's not gonna happen. So if they were still taking people from the coast of Africa, it was gonna be a different coast. Sierra Leone sort of dropped off that radar as it became a free colony. And colony is not even the right word, because again, it's not under the crown. It is a self-sustaining nation. So as it became a free nation, it probably wouldn't have been a port of call for slave ships any longer. Question?
Britain from Robert, did the Europeans finally outlaw slavery in the late 1780s, early 1790s, which would reduce the amount of enslavement out of Africa into the Americas?
Right, so I think Britain, and I know you guys are recording this, and so I'm gonna be on record saying the wrong date. I think Britain was 1803, and America was 1807. So it took us some years longer to do the same thing. And that only outlawed the international slave trade, right? Of course. So people in the United States are continuing to enslave within the country. And I will say, because I do a whole thing on the British Royal Navy too, the British Royal Navy spent a lot of time blockading and hunting down illegal slave ships that were still doing it even after this international law went into effect. So it was still happening. People were complicit all up and down. I mean, there are records and records and records out of Rhode Island and Boston and New York and Philadelphia of under-the-table slave deals that are happening. Everybody in the new United States was complicit. It wasn't just the South. Yeah, so that kept happening, but in theory, it was done by 1807.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
If you're interested in one of the books, they're downstairs, and Karen down
I'll
there.
sit right down there if you have more questions.